Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on Agentic Commerce. We're excited for the next 30 minutes that we have together to talk through a topic that is very much top of mind for everyone at the moment. So I'll give this a couple of seconds for folks to join. And while we do that, feel free to drop into the chat where you are dialing in from. It's always good to see where everyone is. We've got Oxford in the UK, we've got Lisbon, Toronto, Paris, Washington, Uruguay, Germany, a lot of different places coming in. Too many for me to keep up with. It looks like we've got a pretty global audience with us today across a lot of different time zones. So I think some folks are probably dialing in at the very beginning or the very end of their day. All right, so we've got a good number of people with us now. So a quick introduction from me. My name's Amir Uki. I'm the managing director here at Board of Innovation based in New York, where we have our Americas HQ. We are a global company focused on AI transformation, predominantly with innovation, insights, marketing, and commercial teams. And as I said, I'm here in New York, and our European office is based out of Belgium. And we work with clients all over the world. So today, Agentic Commerce, as we said, it's a topic that everyone is talking about at the moment. And the goal for today is to be able to separate the signals that you need to be listening to from a lot of the noise that is in the market. And there's a lot of both, a lot of signals and a lot of noise. So we are going to be specific about what we think is pretty well evidenced, what we think is directionally plausible, and what we think is still kind of speculative. So when a new technology is entering the market, the first instinct, I think, of every growth and marketing team is to map it onto something that is just much more familiar. And we've done it before with social, we've done it with mobile, and we are doing it right now with AI. So the dominant frame is that AI is a new discovery channel. So if you get your brand mentioned and if you track your citations, if you optimize your content, then you can win. So it's looking right now like SEO with a new vocabulary, basically. And that framing isn't completely wrong, but it does miss really the most structurally important thing about what is changing. So Google was a traffic model. Its job was very clear. It was to surface your brand and send someone to you. And then what happened after the click was really between you and the customer. AI is really a very different model because in many cases, it's actually completing the evaluation itself. It's comparing your product against alternatives. It's explaining trade-offs, and it's making a recommendation. And the user may actually never visit your website at all in that flow. So this is a very different problem to how do I rank higher? It's actually a problem about who is intermediating the purchase decision. And that really is the key thing that we want to spend the next 25 minutes to kind of work through. So let's just try and define what we mean by agentic commerce. It's being used to describe at least, I would say, 3 very meaningfully different things that have totally different time horizons and different implications. So the first one is conversational recommendation. So essentially a user is asking ChatGPT or Gemini which product to buy. The AI is giving a recommendation, and it's often happening without the user clicking anywhere external. And this is already, as we all know, happening at scale. And there was research in 2025 that found that nearly half of all consumers are now using AI when searching the internet to look for something or answer a question. So this is very much a present tense behavioral observation. This is not a forecast. And those numbers, I imagine, have only increased since that study. Second type of agentic commerce is what we call agentic task execution. So basically a user is delegating a task like find me some running shoes that are under $120 and that can ship by next month. And then the AI searches, it's evaluating, and it's selecting. So OpenAI's Operator, which was launched, I think, almost a year ago now, or a year ago, is really the first scaled commercial deployment of this model. And again, it's real, but it's very, very early. And the reality is that consumer trust in fully delegated purchasing is still developing. It's very much nascent. And then the third type of agentic commerce is embedded commercial infrastructure, which basically means direct API relationships between AI platforms and commerce systems. So again, just sticking with OpenAI, their agentic commerce protocol, which was built with Stripe, basically lets users complete purchases inside a ChatGPT conversation. And then some of their first integrations were with pretty big companies like Shopify and Etsy. And what's happening there is that the AI isn't discovering those products by reading websites, it's actually querying a structured catalog very directly. So three very different ways that agentic commerce, while it's used as a phrase, kind of expresses itself and manifests itself. And we approach all three of these very, very differently. For today, we are mostly going to be focusing on the first one, where it's very real, it's very much at scale, it's something that we are all trying to figure out at the moment. We always like to try and root this in clear, recent evidence. So the data in this space ranges from very credible to very speculative, and it does matter which data that we're looking at. So we try and rank these on a confidence basis, and some of the findings that we at BOI are most confident in are studies like a Big Bain study last year that found that 30 to 45% of US consumers are now using Gen AI to research products before buying. McKinsey arrives at pretty similar figures. But overall, what we can say is that around half of all consumers, as we said, are using AI in that discovery process, which means that the behavioral shift is already happening. For many people, it has happened already. What's really interesting is that at the same time as that 50%, AI referral traffic to websites is still below 1% of total web traffic. So a study in 2025 showed that over 3.3 billion sessions, AI referrals accounted for just under 1% across all major industries. So anyone telling you that organic search is collapsing right now is probably overstating the case. There is a huge nuance to that 1% number, and we'll unpack that nuance in the slides during this presentation. But there is an interesting tension in that for AI referred visitors, while they are very small in volume, they convert dramatically better than organic search visitors. So a study found that ChatGPT referral traffic converted at around 16% compared to under 2% for Google organic. So what that means is it's suggesting that those visitors are arriving just much further along in their decision process. So the behavioral shift is real, it's large. The traffic shift is real, but small, but the conversion quality is notable. There's a lot of forward projections around where this is going to go. I think there's probably not too much debate that this is very directionally accelerating, and that most companies, if not all companies, are going to need to be reliant on agentic commerce as a core driver of commercial revenue for them. One of the biggest distinctions that we want to highlight is really one that actually most measurement tools are getting wrong at the moment when it comes to agentic commerce. So when AI gets a purchase intent question, two things are happening around your brand. Or it's being recommended and selected, which means that AI is recommending you as the answer. It's explaining why, and it's telling the user to go with you over the competition. And they do sound familiar, but actually they're very, very different. So think of this as being mentioned on, being mentioned is basically the AI equivalent of ranking on a page 2 of Google. So you're technically visible, but commercially you're much less relevant than it would seem. It's really that recommendation where that kind of recommendation layer is where that economic value is found. So think of that as the AI equivalent of having a sales conversation that went in your favor. It's a lot of that BD is happening in that recommendation portion. The challenge with measurement is that almost every measurement dashboard on the market at the moment is tracking mentions, and they're calling it success. And it isn't, because it's really counting the wrong thing. So the diagnostic question for your brand is actually pretty simple. It's, do you know whether AI is actually recommending you? and not just referencing you? And if you're being mentioned but not being recommended, do you know why? So most places, most organizations actually can't answer either question at the moment, and that's where a lot of the work kind of begins. Let's talk about some of the digital channels, because a lot of the channels that you have probably managed before did have one thing in common, which is that your presence in that channel was usually a function of what your brand was doing in that channel. So your Google rankings, for example, would reflect your SEO investment. Your social presence would be kind of a reflection of your content investment. But AI breaks that assumption in a very, very big way. AI models are trained on huge amounts of text from across the web, including reviews, press coverage, analyst reports, Reddit threads, Wikipedia entries, comparison sites, a very, very long list of third-party sources. And what that means is that they've already formed views about your brand, about your product quality, about your competitive positioning during that training process. And those views are now already baked into the model. So when someone is asking a purchase question in your category, AI is drawing on a preformed view. It's likely not really reading your website. It's not checking your latest campaign. There was an interesting analysis by Aerops that found that about 85% of all brand citations in AI outputs are tracing to third-party pages rather than brand-owned domains. So your owned content is, for now, a slightly less important input than we think it is. Again, this is referencing citations and not recommendations. And a big part of what we are working through, and a big challenge that really hasn't been resolved in a particularly scalable or accessible way without quite a bit of investment, is that difference between the citations and the recommendations. So the kind of uncomfortable implication with this is that your brand already has a presence in AI conversations, AI-mediated conversations, but you didn't really have control over that script. So AI may be describing you accurately or incompletely, or positioning you against competitors in ways that you actually wouldn't choose. So you may not know this yet because you may not be monitoring it. One of the most, I think, persistent mistakes that we see is treating AI as a single channel, because it absolutely is not. It's very many different channels with very meaningfully different user bases, different training data, different recommendation tendencies, different commercial architectures. So ChatGPT is still, at the time of writing, the most dominant referral platform by volume. Last study that we referenced was from the end of last year, which found that it was driving 87% of AI referral traffic across, again, most major industry sectors, and has, I think at the time, over 800 million weekly users. So if your brand is being mentioned in AI conversations, it's most likely happening there. Gemini, at the time of writing, was the one to watch in terms of growth trajectory. We are seeing a big surge recently in Claude. A lot of Claude activity does tend to happen at the enterprise level, either in terms of individual workers using it or in terms of enterprise accounts. So it actually has less of an impact on the agentic commerce side of things than somewhere like Gemini, where there's a much bigger growth trajectory. So interesting stats around year-over-year growth for Gemini, 388%. Because Gemini is so deeply integrated with Google search through things like AI overviews, its actual reach is substantially higher than standalone usage would suggest. So we actually think that these statistics are likely a little bit underestimated. And then whenever we're talking about recommendation and agentic commerce, Perplexity, which does have a smaller user base, does generate arguably the highest quality commercial traffic, because it does have a citation-heavy format. It has research-oriented users, and it produces visitors that tend to be further along in the decision process. And then obviously there's a very big growing ecosystem of what we call vertical agents. So think of things like Amazon's Rufus, which are Amazon's Rufus, Walmart has one. Think of kind of category-specific agents that are across different industries, from travel to finance, and platform embedded agents that are being built by Shopify and others. And the critical point is that these platforms, they have different biases, they weight different signals, and a brand that's well positioned in ChatGPT may actually end up being invisible in Gemini. So there really is no single optimization strategy that covers this landscape. And that's one of the strongest arguments for what we call portfolio experimentation. And we'll talk about what those experiments are in a moment. But that experimentation seems to be a much more effective approach than the traditional kind of concentrated optimization approach that was a little bit more the de facto with SEO. Something that we hear a lot is, does this apply to us if we're primarily a B2B business? And the short answer is yes, it definitely does. And actually, in some ways, the B2B implications are a lot more acute. So the earliest and most established stage of agentic commerce in B2B is AI-assisted research. So think of a procurement manager or CFO trying to understand the vendor landscape, and they're doing that research inside an AI conversation rather than through a traditional series of website visits and sales calls. And your brand's representation in that conversation is shaping that initial view of the market really before you've even spoken to, or before the client has even spoken to any vendors. The next stage, which is a little more directional rather than fully established, is the what we call kind of the AI-generated shortlists. So rather than a buying committee member spending weeks and weeks trying to come up with a long list through their own research, they're essentially asking AI to generate a shortlist of vendors that are meeting defined criteria. And what happens is that the vendors who appear get the meeting, and then the vendors who don't may not even be under consideration, not because they were evaluated and rejected, but because they didn't show up in the outputs. Then if we kind of continue along this curve, we have AI involvement in RFP processes, both in terms of drafting requirements and evaluating responses. McKinsey did some 2025 research that found that specification-driven purchases, where criteria is very explicit and quantifiable, they are the categories most likely to automate first. And in B2B terms, that map directly to things like software licensing and commodity procurement. There is kind of an additional layer that makes this pretty acute, I would say, for B2B, which is that AI is influencing the buying committee's thinking way before the human conversation is taking place. So if you're on a BD team or you're a salesperson and you're sitting down with a prospective customer that's already been briefed by AI on the competitive landscape, then you're just walking into a conversation where the framing, the comparisons, the perceived trade-offs have already been established. If your brand is well represented in that briefing already, then great, you arrive in a favorable position. And if not, then you're kind of correcting a misimpression that you may not even know existed. So I do want to just make sure that we don't swing too far in either direction, because a lot of SEO era thinking does still transfer. Some of it doesn't, and some of it is actually actively misleading when applied to AI recommendation systems. But what does transfer is domain authority and the signals that produce it, which include quality content, things like authoritative backlinks, third-party recognition. They're all very relevant inputs. What doesn't transfer cleanly is the core kind of SEO logic that ranking and visibility are directly producing traffic and conversion, because AI-generated recommendations that are not producing a click are basically invisible to your current measurement infrastructure, and they may still be shaping the purchase intent. So some things will hold, some things won't hold. I think what is genuinely new is that a lot of the variables that are driving AI selection are primarily about how your brand is represented in the third-party ecosystem. And even within that, there's variability depending on how established of a brand you are. So third-party ecosystems were signals that were always relevant for SEO, but they were always secondary to on-site optimization. Whereas in AI recommendation systems, especially for established brands, third-party ecosystem signals are primary. So if I were to give kind of an honest summary of this, I think that SEO is a very necessary but insufficient foundation for AI visibility. So brands that are investing in genuine third-party authority are ultimately going to have kind of a structural head start. I want to talk about that 1% AI traffic referral stat from earlier on, because there is a major economic argument for taking this very seriously now, despite those small traffic volumes. And the answer is that traffic volume and commercial impacts aren't really the same. In fact, they're not the same thing. And the gap between them is very, very large in this case. So when someone is clicking through from an AI recommendation, then they've typically been through, as we said, a research and evaluation process within the AI conversation. So you've been compared to alternatives, trade-offs have been explained, there's been some kind of recommendation, and the person who is clicking is actually closer to the bottom of the funnel than the top of the funnel. What we see is that, for example, with ChatGPT, referred traffic converts at around 16% compared to, as we said, 2% for Google Organic. And the implication is that even at 1% of traffic, AI referrals are just accounting for a much more meaningfully higher share of acquisition value than the traffic share is suggesting. I do think that there is a kind of structural problem that exists in terms of how organizations are currently accounting for AI's influence. And what your analytics can see is basically direct referral clicks from platforms like a ChatGPT. And with those platforms, or with ChatGPT specifically, you can now tag the referral source. So OpenAI began appending what we call the UTM parameters, I think midway through last year. So you can start to see now in your analytics whether someone is clicking through from ChatGPT. What you can't see is the much bigger category of AI influence journeys that are not producing a direct click. So a user who is asking Claude for a software recommendation and then is deciding based on that conversation, but then searching for your brand directly, is going to show up as branded search traffic. There's going to be no trace of AI influence. And even Google AI overview clicks are actually appearing inside your organic numbers. They don't have a separate label. So it's estimated that really the influence of AI on traffic is at least 2 to 3 times what analytics are reporting because of those zero-click AI interactions. Let's look at where action is very much warranted and kind of grounded in evidence. So 4 different levers here that we tend to focus on here at BOI. So the first and most important lever, as we said, is the third-party digital ecosystem. Those are the dominant inputs to how AI systems are representing your brand. And for a lot of established brands, your owned web presence, as we said, is actually a more minor factor. So the work of managing your AI representation basically needs to be reframed as a third-party presence management, not just website optimization. And we'll talk about the impact in a bit on org structure around who should own that. But the second lever is structured around product data. So whether you're thinking about AI recommendations today, or if you're preparing maybe for a world where AI agents are transacting on behalf of users, then clean and structured product data is critical. It's foundational. Pricing consistency, availability accuracy, attribute completeness, these are all signals that agents are using when making purchase decisions. So if you haven't audited your product data quality recently, then that should be absolutely an immediate priority. And then third lever is, I'd say, pretty relevant for brands that have significant scale, and that's the commercial conversations with AI platforms directly. Understandably, this is a smaller portion of the typical audience, but Shopify, Etsy integrations with OpenAI's Agentic Commerce protocol do represent kind of a new model of basically direct commercial access. That means that you get to bypass the whole question of whether you have organic AI visibility or not. And these conversations are happening now. There's quite a few brands at the table early, and those that do end up securing those deals probably are going to have a structural advantage as the market develops. And then fourth lever here is monitoring and measurements. We all know that you can't manage what you can't see. So at the very minimum, every growth leader here should have a clear picture of how your brand is currently described and how it's recommended across major AI platforms, at least in purchase relevant queries. That's just basic competitive intelligence in this new environment. With this, we have a couple of things that we think probably for now are not as important as it may seem. So don't jump into a huge replatform of your entire website just in the name of AI readability. Don't abandon SEO. We know that organic search is still the dominant source of web traffic. Google is still sending 345 times more traffic to websites than all AI platforms combined. Don't treat citation tracking alone as a measure of commercial performance. Don't try and implement just universal optimization lists. Different types of intervention have very different effects depending on a brand's existing training data, your footprints, how well established you are. So if anyone is trying to kind of sell you a one-size-fits-all approach, then make sure you're asking to show brand-specific evidence for those recommendations. It really is, in our opinion, almost impossible now to not treat this as a brand-by-brand assessment. And oftentimes we are looking at specific categories within brands that have very, very different levers that can kind of be pulled on to win in the agentic commerce race. So let's talk a little bit about what to do in more detail. So there really is, as I said, no very proven universal playbook for AI commerce optimization. The system is very new, it's very fragmented, and it's too unstable in its current state for really high confidence kind of prescriptions to exist. So for an operator, for a marketer that is looking for a clear answer, that's obviously frustrating. But if you're a marketer, an operator, a growth team member who's basically willing to be disciplined about experimentation in this kind of environment of uncertainty, then it's actually a really great opportunity, because when there is no established playbook, the advantages end up falling to organizations that are experimenting most rigorously, that are learning fastest. So while we've said that there is no kind of universally agreed upon playbook of how to do this in the way that there is for SEO, what we're seeing is that actually organizations are the most fired up to try and solve this that they have been, because now is the time when you can start to get that early advantage before heterogeneity sets in down the line. So when we say experimentation, this is kind of how we think about it. Uncertainty, in our opinion, is not an instruction to wait. It's just an instruction to act differently than you would in a very well understood system. In a well understood system, you find that playbook, you implement it, you measure against benchmarks. In a less stable system, the equivalent discipline looks very different. So organizations that are navigating this early stage of agentic commerce, they do tend to share, I would say, a pretty specific disposition, which is that they are able to distinguish between what they know, what they can test, and what they genuinely don't know yet. And they act very aggressively on the first two without claiming certainty on the third. And we're doing a lot of work in the agentic commerce space, and everyone that we are working with, I would say, very much falls into that first batch where they are able to say, hey, we know this and we don't know this. Let's start experimenting to figure out specifically to us what we need to do to close that gap. And this is going to be kind of the frame for everything that will follow. We're not going to take a here is the answer approach, but we do want to show a structured process for how to kind of operate in this early agentic commerce environment. So we follow a framework that is based around a set of pretty organized questions, pretty organized audit priorities, experiments, and capability investments. And what they do is that they basically represent the most defensible allocation of attention that you can give based on what we currently know about agentic commerce. So for pretty self-explanatory, I think, work streams, which are understand, basically build a clear picture of where you currently stand, measure, which means establish your tracking infrastructure, see what's currently invisible, and experiment. So run small, deliberate portfolios of experiments, interventions, whatever we want to call them, but just make sure that they have very clear hypotheses. And then once we know that, you can then move on to developing the internal capabilities that ideally over time will start to compound. The order does matter for this because there's no point running experiments before you have a clear picture of the current state. There's no point building capabilities before you have measurement infrastructure that will tell you if those capabilities are even producing results. So the order is very important for this. So the first work stream is understanding where you stand right now. Most organizations do not have a systematic picture of how AI is currently representing their brand when it comes to purchase intent conversations, purchase relevant conversations. So your first task is to do a structured query audit. So take 20 or 30 or 40 of your most commercially important purchase intent queries in your category, specific to you, run them across different AI platforms and document what comes back. Are you being mentioned? Are you being recommended? On what basis are you being recommended? What competitors is AI mentioning alongside you, and how is it framing the comparison? Second task is to audit your third-party presence. So go to the sources that AI most commonly draws on, which could include things like your Wikipedia page, your Reddit page, your review pages, and comparison sites actually are becoming even more important. But audit their accuracy. Audit their completeness, audit their recency. Your third-party ecosystem is going to look very different from another company's third-party ecosystem. So make sure that you haven't got outdated information or gaps in your product coverage in these sources that are going to end up being directly reflected in how AI is representing your brand. And then the output of this first step is a very clear baseline. We want to know, where are we? What is AI saying about us? And what is the gap between what AI is saying about us and what we would want to say about ourselves? Second work stream is measurement. And I'll be very direct. This is one that a lot of organizations, I would say, are currently flying a little blind on when it comes to AI's commercial influence. So I'll highlight two key actions here. The first being to set up a dedicated AI traffic channel in whatever analytics you are using. So we mentioned earlier that ChatGPT began appending its UTM parameters, again, focused on citation links. It doesn't take too long to be able to segment your analytics into a dedicated AI channel. It's about less than an hour, I would say, to implement, but it does immediately make AI referred traffic visible from some sources in your weekly performance reporting. And then second is to add branded search volume tracking as a leading indicator of AI-influenced awareness. This is one of the most common questions that we get, and one of the hardest to solve, is how do we measure the impact of these changes that we are making in kind of the goal of owning agentic commerce. A lot of AI-influenced purchase journeys, as we said, they're not producing a direct click. The user is deciding based on the conversation. They're searching for your brand directly. So an uplift in branded search volume, if you are able to isolate it, is a very clear signal that AI is generating a preference that isn't captured yet in your usual attribution. But this is an area that is probably one of the hardest. It's especially tricky as when it comes to investment in agentic commerce. Most leaders want to be able to assign that to a very specific uplift revenue conversion metric, which is much harder with agentic commerce than it was with SEO. Let's look at some of the experiments. And again, very different for different organizations, but good experimentation here means a clear hypothesis. It means a predefined measurement criterion and a minimum observation window that is accounting for what is likely going to be a lag between action and AI system response. And sometimes it can be a day for changes to be crawled and to show up in AI recommendations, and sometimes it can be a week or multiple weeks. But disciplined documentation of the results, including those that are disproving a hypothesis, is super important. So 4 of the experiments that we like to run are a third-party content quality intervention. As we said, pick 3 of your most commercially important external presence points and then systematically improve them. Monitor the AI recommendation behavior. It's low cost, it's grounded in evidence, and it's immediately actionable. What those improvements look like is different for different third-party sources. So we mentioned a couple of them earlier in terms of making sure that information is complete, is accurate, that you are being conveyed in the way that you would like to be conveyed. The second experiment is to work through your product catalog and assess whether your prices are consistent, current, whether attributes are complete, as we said, whether availability information is accurate. Third experiment is in identifying a small number of very high authority publications or comparison platforms or your equivalent for your industry that AI is regularly citing in your category. Invest in appearing there. Track what that coverage changes, and you can capture that pretty easily within 60 to 90 days of the action. And then last experiment here, and again, there's many more that can happen beyond these 4. Typically, when we're doing this work, the experiments look very different for each client, depending again on their size, how established they are, their portfolio of products and services, the category they're in, etc. But a 4th recommendation that most likely will work for you is to identify which AI platforms are actually most commercially active for your category and concentrate your initial visibility efforts there. And then measure if that targeted effort on one platform is producing different results than a distributed effort across all of them. I would say run 2 or 3 of these simultaneously maximum. Don't do all 4, don't do more than 4, and make sure that you're learning before you scale. And then if you do that, then the final work stream will be about how do we make sure that these capabilities can compound over time? Because whatever the platform landscape looks like in 12 months, which is likely going to be drastically different to now, we know that certain organizational capabilities are going to be valuable regardless. So your growth team should be able to run a systematic kind of AI representation audit. They should be able to interpret what they're finding, translate it into actionable priorities. It's not an analytical skill or a technical skill. It can be developed pretty quickly without vendor dependence. What I also have confidence in is that clean, consistently structured, API accessible product data is going to stay foundational. It has been, it is currently, it likely will always be a key route when it comes to agentic commerce. So whether you're optimizing for organic AI recommendations or if you are building towards those direct platform integrations, if that's your aspiration, then this investment, it does pay off regardless of the path that you are choosing. And then the third one here is, again, around the third-party presence management. So this is, you can start, obviously, and we recommend you start with a one-time audit, but ultimately this is going to end up being an ongoing operational function. So brands that are maintaining a strong AI recommendation position over time, they are the ones that are systematically monitoring and improving their external ecosystem consistently. The challenge with that is whose responsibility is that? And this is one of the final points I want to close out with before summarizing. But agentic commerce does sit at the intersection of a couple of existing functions. So SEO owns organic search presence and content strategy typically. PR and comms is owning press coverage and analyst relationships, which is what the third-party ecosystem AI is drawing on most heavily. Sometimes partnerships are owning the commercial conversations with platforms, and then you've got digital teams and e-com teams that are owning the product data infrastructure. In most of these organizations, each of these functions do actually have a very legitimate claim on part of the problem. And that means that there's no real clarity at the moment over who owns it cleanly. What's going to happen over time is that there's probably going to be a kind of diffused accountability where everyone is near the problem, but no one is responsible actually for solving the problem. For now, we see very different teams that we're working with as we solve this. there are a couple of organizational models that can start to address this over time. Each has different trade-offs depending on who the designated owner is. I would say, just in terms of practical guidance, that the minimum viable step that I think can be conducted over, say, 90 days is actually just to name a single accountable person, not a whole committee, not a whole working group, but someone that is actually responsible for producing the current state picture, coordinating the experiments, and then reporting back to leadership. Really, the worst outcome that can happen is that the answer to who owns agentic commerce is we all do, because that's basically a guarantee that there's going to be underinvestments in this kind of period of time where learning is just so critical, and learning fast is so critical. It's the primary competitive variable right now with agentic commerce. So a challenge, again, that is unsolved. It'll be interesting to see how these responsibilities start to formalize over the next 12 months. But for now, minimum viable approach, I would say, is try and name someone accountable that could be across any of these teams that we've mentioned. So I know we're a little bit over time for the webinar, so I'll close this out by talking a little bit about the disposition that I think this moment is calling for. The structural shift in AI is very, very real in agentic commerce, in fact. AI systems are, they're already intermediating purchase decisions. They're doing it at a pretty big scale. The behavioral change is here. What is not yet real is this very proven, very stable playbook for responding to it. What I think will happen is that brands that are coming out of this experimentation period in the strongest position are going to be the ones, as I said, that have built a genuine understanding of how AI is representing them. They're building a rigorous measurement infrastructure. They're running disciplined experiments. They are building those durable capabilities while the market is still forming. That is an advantage that they are locking in. So if there are three things to take away from today, I would say the first would be just understand whether you're being mentioned or actively recommended. The second would be build that measurement framework before you're building solutions, because you can't manage, as we know, what you can't see. And then the third is treat this as a portfolio problem and not just a channel problem. There really is no single winning approach or single winning strategy or a winning answer that is going to work for everyone yet. So we're in this early chapter of a very important structural change, and our kind of POV is that the leaders that are engaging it with rigor and with kind of honesty, that have a tolerance for operating in this kind of uncertainty and doing these experiments, are going to be the ones that have an advantage in agentic commerce. So we covered a lot today. A big thank you to everyone for joining. And we will be sharing this webinar and this deck out. And if anyone would like to discuss what agentic commerce means specifically for your company, for your brands, for your industry, as we know, the approach is very different for everyone, then we're very happy to jump on a call and kind of talk through your specific use case and maybe give you a few recommendations on what we would do in terms of starting to win the agentic commerce race. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you next time.